It was precisely 10 o'clock on a Thursday evening when I reached the quiet, but unmistakable conclusion that the situation next door had progressed beyond the point of patient tolerance, because for several consecutive nights, the music pouring from my neighbor's backyard speakers had grown louder and more intrusive, and on this particular evening the bass was vibrating so persistently through the shared boundary of our properties that the glass in my kitchen cabinets produced a faint, irregular tremor, while the framed photographs along my hallway walls shifted almost imperceptibly with each heavy beat, creating a sensory reminder that I was no longer enjoying the simple comfort of my own home, but instead involuntarily participating in someone else's late-night gathering. Although I have always believed that living in a residential neighborhood requires a degree of flexibility and mutual understanding, and although I had deliberately ignored the previous evenings, in the hope that the noise represented a temporary celebration rather than a recurring pattern, I found myself glancing repeatedly at the clock with increasing frustration as the hour turned later and the music intensified rather than subsided, because I had an early morning obligation that required rest and clarity of mind, and the steady percussion reverberating through my walls made relaxation impossible. After several minutes of internal debate during which I weighed the potential outcomes of either enduring the disturbance in silence or addressing it directly, I chose the approach that seemed most respectful and proportionate, which was to walk next door and request politely that the volume be reduced, since it seemed both unreasonable and unnecessarily confrontational to involve law enforcement, without first attempting a simple conversation between neighbors who share not only proximity, but the implicit responsibility of coexistence. When I stepped outside onto my porch, the contrast between the cool night air and the pulsing warmth of irritation within me was striking, and as I crossed the narrow stretch of lawn toward her driveway, I rehearsed my words carefully in my head, determined to avoid accusatory language or an elevated tone, because my intention was not to challenge her right to enjoy her property, but to seek a compromise that acknowledged both her desire for entertainment and my need for quiet after a reasonable hour. The music softened briefly when I knocked on her front door, and she appeared moments later holding a drink, her posture rigid and her expression already edged with defensiveness, as though she had anticipated criticism and braced herself for confrontation before I had even spoken a word. I greeted her with a measured nod and explained calmly that the music was carrying strongly into my house and that, since it was now 10 o'clock, I would appreciate it if she could lower the volume slightly, emphasizing that I was not asking her to end her gathering, but merely to reduce the intensity of the bass so that the vibration would not continue to penetrate my walls. Rather than considering the request as a neighborly appeal, she reacted as though I had issued an order, her eyebrows lifting sharply and her voice sharpening as she responded that she was allowed to play music on her own property and that 10 o'clock was not, in her view, an unreasonable hour for entertainment. And although I reiterated that I understood her right to host guests and that my concern was limited to the excessive volume rather than the gathering itself, she dismissed the distinction entirely and informed me that if I had a problem I could call the police. Recognizing that the conversation was shifting from dialogue to defiance, and unwilling to escalate the tension by matching her tone, I concluded the exchange by saying that I had simply hoped to resolve it directly, then turned and walked back toward my house, believing that even if pride prevented her from conceding in the moment, she might reconsider once the interaction ended. Instead, the music resumed at an even greater intensity within seconds of my return indoors, the bass amplifying in a way that felt less accidental and more intentional, as though the volume itself had become a statement of resistance. And while I stood in my living room contemplating whether to call the non-emergency line to inquire about local noise regulations, I noticed flashing red and blue reflections moving across my walls, an unexpected and disorienting sight that prompted me to look out the window and discover a patrol car parked in front of my house rather than hers. Before I could fully process the implication of that detail, there was a firm knock at my door, and when I opened it, the officers stood there with expressions that were neutral but purposeful, informing me that they had received a call reporting that I had entered my neighbor's property and threatened her over the music. The accusation struck me with a mixture of disbelief and frustration, because not only had I avoided raising my voice or using confrontational language, but I had deliberately framed my request as a question rather than a demand, and yet the narrative she presented to authorities transformed a calm exchange into an act of aggression, a reinterpretation that underscored how differently the same moment can be perceived depending on one's predisposition. Maintaining composure despite the absurdity of the situation, I explained that I had knocked on her door, asked politely for a reduction in volume, and left without argument, which she declined, and I offered to show the officers the footage from my security camera, which had captured the interaction in its entirety from the vantage point of my porch. Standing just inside my doorway, we reviewed the recording together, and the video confirmed precisely what I had described: my measured tone, her raised voice, my departure without escalation, and no trace of threatening behavior, which prompted the officers to acknowledge that there was no evidence supporting the allegation made against me. They then informed me that there was indeed a local noise ordinance in effect after 10 o'clock, and that they would speak with her regarding the volume level, a detail that subtly shifted the focus of the situation back to its original issue rather than the reframed accusation. From my window, I observed their conversation on her porch, noting that her gestures were animated at first, but gradually subdued as the officers maintained a steady and professional demeanor. And within minutes, the music dropped to a significantly lower level, the bass no longer reverberating through my walls. When the officers returned briefly to confirm that the matter had been addressed, one of them suggested that in future instances I might consider contacting them directly rather than approaching her, advice that, while practical, left me reflecting on the irony that an attempt at neighborly courtesy had resulted in being falsely portrayed as a threat. After they departed and the street returned to quiet, I remained standing in my living room for several minutes, absorbing the sudden stillness and contemplating how a straightforward request had escalated into police involvement, not because of hostility on my part, but because of a defensive interpretation on hers. And I recognized that while shared spaces inevitably produce occasional friction, the difference between resolution and escalation often lies in whether individuals view compromise as cooperation or as surrender. In the days that followed, our interactions were limited to restrained nods devoid of warmth, yet the late-night music never again exceeded a reasonable volume, suggesting that while her initial response had been to weaponize the situation through a distorted report, the outcome ultimately reinforced the very boundary I had sought through conversation. The experience left me more aware of the fragility of neighborly relationships and the importance of remaining composed when accusations arise, because composure not only preserves one's credibility, but also ensures that reality, when examined objectively, has the opportunity to prevail over mischaracterization. And although the incident did not result in any formal consequences, it served as a lasting reminder that in communities where homes stand only feet apart, mutual respect is not optional, but essential for preserving both peace and perspective.